Hi,
Dr. Burke Harris. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm so happy to meet you.
Your glasses are so cute.
They are? You know what's
Yeah.
funny? I've gone completely blind during this whole post-COVID thing. I already was having trouble reading, and then being on Zooms all day, my eyesight is gone. And I found this company called Caddis, Caddis. They make the cutest readers. I'll show you the other pair that I love. They're heavier.
I think it's a fantastic look on you.
I mean, what can I do? I've got to embrace it.
Actually, well, that's what we're doing right now. I feel like we're embracing some of the things that we would not have chosen, but that is how things are right now.
You look beautiful, by the way.
Well, I'm talking to Gwyneth Paltrow. I gotta like bring my A game.
And meanwhile, I have no makeup and like, oh, what are you gonna do?
Well, anyways, you radiate from the inside out. You don't need to have any makeup. So there you go.
Thank you. They're very sweet. Oh gosh, I have so much I want to ask you about, but I guess for the edification of whoever's going to be reading this, maybe you could just talk to me a little bit about your background, and I wanted to also know specifically how, even in your education, you started to make the link between trauma and health. Like, why were you drawn to go to this disenfranchised part of San Francisco and start a practice?
So I would say so to answer your last question first, my family's from Jamaica. I'm like I'm the immigrant, big Jamaican family, the whole thing. And also my dad is super Catholic, super Catholic. And so we were really raised in this way of like, you just give to the community, like when you're from a small tribe, it's just everyone takes care of each other and looks out for each other. And I think especially the way that my dad raised us in terms of giving back to those who are least fortunate and that kind of stuff. I've always felt really connected to being, to caring for underserved communities. And also like, you can't grow up Black in America and not feel outraged by the terrible health disparities that are still going on, every day. And when we're talking about health disparities, we're talking about differences in like people living or dying, right? People losing their loved ones, people just having kids having the opportunity to grow up and be healthy. And so that was the reason why I wanted to go and work in a really underserved neighborhood, and why I went to Bayview Hunters Point. Because I will tell you, like, for me doing my training, like I did my residency at Stanford, and then before that I did my master's in public health at Harvard, and it's like, that's who they need in the hood. You don't need a like I will say, I'm sure your kids have a fantastic doctor, but I'm sure if they didn't, you would be an advocate and you would say, this doesn't seem right to me. And you would pursue, and you would use, influence and everything that you can as a mama bear to get what you need. And the people who need like the most amazing on it doctor are the people who don't have that, right? Who don't have don't have as much capacity or education or ability to advocate or power, social power, or any of that stuff. And so that's why I wanted to go work in Hunters Point.
I just want to, I want to carry that thread through, but I just had a question about your dad. So, and this might be just out of left field, but how does one reconcile being a very strong Catholic and a scientist at the same time, a chemist, a doctor?
I think for my dad, it was like part and parcel. So part of it was that he went to a Jesuit high school, and the Jesuit teaching is very much kind of deep into the science and probing and testing and asking questions. And so his approach to science wasn't this like it came down on high and that's the way that it is. It was very much like, look at the miracle of this molecule, right? And how amazing it is, right? Like so it was very consistent, his faith and his scientific.
That's so interesting to me, because I think part of the issue with society, and I think it's been highlighted by this COVID time, is that we're living in this age of science where if it's not empirically provable, it can't exist, it can't be true. Which also relates to your work and how you started to make connections, without a huge data set to understand cause and effect, and you're proving that now. But I always wonder, how when physicians really have faith, it seems like such an amazing mix of the two things, because we have, I think that lack of faith is what leads to hoarding toilet paper. It's like, it's like the fear, this becomes the religion. And in a lot of ways, I think that our reliance on only science and not the God part, causes a lot of that in our culture.
So I will, I will say for me, the experience of one of the ways that it shows up for me is that science for me is an amazing tool that I feel like I apply in doing work that is to work to heal the world, right? Like science doesn't, so I'll tell you something crazy. I've never told anyone this before, but this is really funny. When I went to do my TED Talk, and I know you're like, this is crazy. She's never told anybody, she's telling Gwyneth Paltrow, but whatever. But this is a really amazing conversation, because when I went to do my TED Talk, I was super nervous, crazy nervous. And literally my knees were knocking and like my legs were shaking. And I closed my eyes right before I got up. And I literally said, Lord, if it is your will to let this message move through me and into the world, like, let that happen right now. And it was very calming for me. And I'm not like I don't go to church every Sunday. I'm not like the whatever, but for me, it was about like a higher purpose or a deeper meaning, easing suffering in the world, which I feel like is, it's as much a spiritual endeavor as it is a scientific endeavor.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredibly profound and beautiful. Wow. Okay. Just going to breathe through that one for a second. So, I just started your book because I just got it I'm fascinated by it and I can't wait to finish it. Because I've always felt like the way we live our lives is in America, and maybe it's potentially different in other cultures, but that the bad things that happen to us become a footnote, and we're not taught at the time how to process trauma. And it's so incredible to see your observations around adverse childhood experiences and like actual health, heart health, asthma, etc. And so I did, and it's quite, I don't know, punk rock to start to put those things together and to create, you know, this science around childhood adversity and the effects of it. So did people think when you started to ideate this, did you have resistance to this, or were they sort of nonplussed? Like, what was the reaction of your colleagues?
So it was, you'll get to enjoy a little bit of this journey as I talk about it in the book. It was a really interesting experience. It was the full range, right? There were some people, who were like, that's really cute, that you're doing this work and the science and the stress. I think there were, I will say that for me, an interesting part of the story that I don't talk about a lot in the book, but it is really inextricably a part of my story, is how, for me, race also plays a role, right?
Yeah.
Because when you're like, you know, when you're the only Black person in, like, you know, your science class at Berkeley that's got 1,000 people in it, right? Or when you're like, for me, I was, you know, one of a very, very small handful of Black people in my medical school class. And what happened is that you kind of don't get the luxury of being a goof off, right? Because people look at you and they see Black people, right? And so you've probably heard this from your Black friends, where it's like there's this sense of a different level of excellence that's required. And so for me, that lesson came through when I first started learning about adverse childhood experiences and understanding that I was not only learning about the science and applying the science to heal my patients, but that I was also going out there and I had to represent it in the world. When you ask the question of like, did people take it seriously? I mean, part of the thing that you'll experience in the book, and part of that you'll just see, even for example, with my TED Talk, is that my message always includes a blend of like real life, like, hey, this is how it shows up. This is what it looks and feels like. And I don't mess around when it comes to the science. Like, I'll tell you, I know my shit. And I'm not joking, like it really is. And so when people would say like, oh, that's not really a thing, right? Or that's not really scientific, or that's just, you know, that's just how life is, or it's just behavior, right? I would be like, actually, you know, individuals with higher risk of, you know, with higher doses of adversity have downregulated beta agonist receptor in their pulmonary endothelium, right? And so someone who's,
I don't know what you just said, but yes.
Yeah, exactly, right? But someone who's a pulmonologist, I'm like, oh, that's your thing. Oh, you're an immunologist. You're another doctor. You're a researcher. You're a head of a hospital. You're whoever. Like, I am going to know, not like have read it and kind of think of whatever, but there are so many people who have experienced such adversity, right? That they need me to know my shit. And they need me to be able to, when I make the case, that the full weight of the science is behind it. And so it's a long answer to your question, but the people received it in a whole bunch of different ways. And my response always to that is to be extremely, extremely rigorous with the science. And as a result, what we've seen is that there's been a transformation. In the past decade, like I went from people being like, oh, you know, whatever, to California is implementing, you know, the largest initiative ever in terms of training doctors on how to screen for and respond to childhood adversity.
It's incredible. Is there, and this might be a weird question, but is there any sort of correlation between length or severity of trauma and susceptibility later in life to these health issues?
Yeah, so the way that it works is the cumulative adversity is what impacts health. And the piece of it that's important is that it's a combination of the exposure, including, the length, the severity, the duration, also the different types of trauma. So like when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, those include, there are 10 different categories, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, physical, emotional neglect, growing up in a household where a parent was mentally ill, substance dependent, incarcerated, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. And so the interesting thing is what the data shows when you look at an ACE score, for example, if someone has an ACE score of 4, it means that they had experienced 4 of those categories. It doesn't say how severely or intensely or for how long, but it does give a good sense of like, if you are a child, you're growing up in a household and you experience both physical abuse and sexual abuse and neglect, and you had a parent who was depressed, like you get a sense of the day-to-day, the cumulative experience that your body has to absorb. And so that's a really important component. But the other really important component is that we all have a different level of vulnerability, right? So it's just like height, right? Like some people, because of the way they're born, their family history, their genetics, some people are 4'11", some people are 6'5", right? And so some people can experience really significant adversity and have less of a biological impact, and some people can even with smaller doses of adversity have a really kind of outsized impact. So it's a combination, and then obviously the other piece of the combination is the buffering, right? So if you experience moderate adversity, but you had lots of nurturing, oh my gosh, the data on this is awesome. So if you have this checks out, if you have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, like your risk for certain health problems is like, double as compared to someone who had 0. But then if you also had tons of buffering, right? You had loving parents who you had an adult who you always trusted and looked out for you, you felt loved, you felt cared for, all of that stuff, that actually reduces the risk of the negative health outcome. Yeah, but by a lot, by like, 50 to 60%.
And what happens in the body when we experience stress that leads to this?
Yeah, so when we experience stress, it activates our fight or flight response. And that happens in a couple of ways. It's a combination between our brain. So the amygdala in our brain activates the fear response. And then that triggers the release of all these stress hormones. And there are a whole lot of stress hormones, but the ones that the ones that are most commonly known are adrenaline and cortisol, right? So we all know adrenaline, that's like when you go skiing and you're, right? And you're going really fast and your heart is pounding really hard and you're like, that's adrenaline. So adrenaline can be, people talk about the adrenaline rush, right? But what adrenaline does is it increases your blood pressure, your blood sugar, it shunts blood to your big muscles, and so that you can, have, you're literally like your muscles are, slightly stronger, like they work harder and more efficiently. And then the other one is cortisol. So adrenaline is more of a short-term stress hormone, and the other one is cortisol, which is more of a long-term stress hormone. And if you think about what would trigger cortisol, it's kind of like, historically, you might think of something like famine, right? Or drought. That is like back when we were running in the plains in Africa, right? Like that's the, famine was a real major stressor. And so cortisol also raises your blood pressure, your blood sugar. It actually can make you slightly more aggressive, right? Interestingly, cortisol, so tell me if this is too much, but it turns out that almost every cell in your body has a receptor for cortisol, right? And part of the reason for that is because when cortisol is released, it is a signal to the body that you're experiencing a long-term stress. And so it's trying to mobilize your brain and body to be able to survive better in long-term stress. And so it can affect your immune system, right? When you activate your stress response, it also activates the immune response. It can affect your, like one of the things, it can make people a little bit more aggressive, because if you're in the Serengeti and there's no food, if you're more aggressive than the next guy, you're more likely to survive, right? And so it also inhibits the part of the brain that's responsible for like executive functioning, like judgment and impulse control and all of those things. And so these are a lot of the effects that we see of stress on the body. It's on the brain, it's on our hormones, it's on our immune system, and then it's even on the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Because if you're experiencing these long-term stressors, you actually want the body to be able to adapt. And so it affects what we call the epigenetic regulation, which is, it's not your genetic code, but it's the way your genetic code is expressed. So like if you think about your DNA as musical, as like sheet music, or musical notes, epigenetic regulation is like the musical notations. It'll be like, hey, play that part again, or play it, forte, or, or, softer, like pianissimo, or whatever it is. And that's how our environment triggers the release of these hormones, and these hormones change the way our DNA is read and transcribed.
And then I imagine so if you compound childhood adversity and you're in a more disenfranchised part of America, and you're like it touches on in your book, the area where you work was a toxic waste dump. I'm sure there aren't regulations around no metals in the water the way that there should be in many parts of the country. And so I would imagine it has a compounding effect on a lot of these things.
Yeah, it's interesting. Many of, so the doctor who discovered the lead in the water in Flint is a good girlfriend of mine. And it's interesting that Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, and when many of the effects of lead poisoning are very similar to the effects of toxic stress, like the impact that it has on the brain is very, very similar. And actually some of the interventions that we do to help kids are really similar as well. But you're exactly right. But the interesting thing about it, and this is one point, is that the adverse childhood experiences study, so this big research study done by the CDC and Kaiser, it wasn't done in a neighborhood like the one I served. It was done in Kaiser San Diego. Their population was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. And I think that was actually a really big eye opener, because when you work in Hunters Point, people expect it. Like people look at the situation and say, oh, those folks have worse health outcomes. It's because they're poor, or they are in poverty, or whatever. But it turns out like rich white people that experience a lot of adversity also have really poor outcomes. It's just the biology of how adversity affects your body.
And interesting that there are almost different different constitutions weather it differently and survive better or have better outcomes depending on, I don't know what, just.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on a lot of things. It depends on a combination of, like supportive factors, right? So for example, some of the things that you might, it's number one, the total cumulative adversity, because the
Right.
10 ACEs are the ones that they studied in the research study, right? But then if you have the adversity of discrimination, that's going to add to your cumulative adversity, right? Or if you have the adversity of, your stress response is activated because you don't know whether you're going to pay rent or whether you're going to be evicted, or because there's violence on the street in the community, that adds to your cumulative adversity. So there's a differential exposure. And then there's also like the more resources you have in your community to support individuals, families, parents, kids, right? Like if you're in a neighborhood where you may be experiencing a ton of adversity in your home, right? But you go to school and your teachers are well supported and they're able to be that safe, stable, nurturing relationship for the kid, those kids are going to be better off.
Right.
But if you're in this under-resourced, underperforming, totally overtaxed school system, right, then it becomes much, again, like you're just taking away the opportunities for resilience and support.
So I want to ask you, are there interventions or modalities that can be applied after trauma to reverse some of these health effects from long-term childhood trauma?
Do you mean immediately after or like long-term after?
I mean long-term, like,
Yeah.
are there ways that these children like can help reframe what happened to them and experience the more connection or love they're able to experience, the more that they heal, and then the more that, or the less that they're at risk for some of these diseases?
Yeah. So this is my favorite part of this work, right? So randomized controlled trials, they took kids where they took kids who were institutionalized children. So they were in orphanages, right? And they randomized them into either high quality nurturant care, right, within their orphanage, or care as usual, which is sad, right? Like, I mean, it's sad to say that care as usual is like the opposite of high quality nurturing care.
Right.
And they did this when the kids were 2 years old, and they did MRIs of their brain. And then they look at kids who were never institutionalized. And what they found was that the kids who were randomized into high quality nurturing caregiving, their brains, the brain structure on MRI looked like the kids who had never been institutionalized.
Wow.
Right? Like, so when we talk about safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments are healing for kids, we're not just talking about like, oh, it's so nice to have. It's actually what we see is we can see changes in brain structure and function. We can see changes in immune profile. We can see changes in the level of stress hormones. And there are a bunch of interventions. So one of the most important things with this whole process is recognizing what's going on to begin with. It's recognizing, oh my goodness, because of what you've experienced, your body may be making more stress hormones than it should. It can look and feel like this. How does it show up for you, right? So just recognizing that. And I found that for my patients, just that bit of information, like the number one answer that I get when I say that to my patients is, oh, you mean I'm not crazy? It's like, no, not at all, right? Like this is actually the normal response for someone who's experienced what you've experienced, right? That is really powerful. And then recognizing, so then when we look at the evidence and like, again, looked at thousands of research studies, some of the things that help to regulate stress hormones, because we now know what we're trying to target. We're trying to target the activation of the stress response, right? And so that includes, the healthy relationships, regular exercise, right? So exercise, the other thing that exercise does, and I feel like this is a physician heal thyself moment right now, because there's a lot of stress happening in my life right now. But exercise not only helps to metabolize stress hormones, but it also releases something called BDNF, which is brain derived neurotrophic factor. And it's like miracle grow for brain cells. It actually stimulates our ability to make new neural connections, right? And that's exactly what you want to do for someone who's had a history of adversity. So exercise, really important. Good sleep hygiene, really important, because when we're sleeping, our stress response recalibrates itself. So like, you notice when you don't sleep, like when you miss sleep, you feel in your body like it's a stressor. Have you ever felt that? Like you feel kind of worn out, and it turns out that like your levels of cortisol and your stress response resets itself when you're sleeping. And so when you miss sleep, your stress response can be more dysregulated. So sleep, nutrition is a really important one, because it also, another important part of the way the stress response affects our health is that for folks who have a history of high doses of adversity, they have an increased likelihood of insulin resistance, right? So insulin is also part of this whole stress process. And so having a diet that really limits refined carbohydrates to reduce that insulin spike is also an important part of a diet that can help to regulate the stress response. And then the other piece is in terms of that.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm. No, go ahead.
Is that why something like metformin is prescribed for longevity?
I had not heard, I've not heard of metformin being prescribed for longevity, but it's interesting.
I was talking to a longevity doctor the other day, and
really
prescribed it in their practice for longevity. Yeah.
Really? Wow, that's fascinating. Well, insulin resistance is a really, the role of insulin and is a really important part of the pathology of the way that stress affects our health. I'll have to read about that. I had never heard of that, so that's fascinating.
It's kind of cool. So, I guess they probably also want me to ask you about like broader, but I think this pertain because I think a lot of us, as you said, like where the study was done at Kaiser, wouldn't necessarily be characterized as, a neighborhood that was dealing with an extra amount of this stuff, and yet it still persists. So, and I think all of us to some degree have some childhood trauma and adversity. So we know now, okay, so exercise is really important, diet, nutrition. Are there anything, what else do you encourage your patients to do in terms of, what you said before, the naming of it sounds like that is such a relief, right? To have somebody name what's going on and just expose it. So do you think that shame plays a part in this? So, if these things happen to you and you're carrying shame, do you think that the way that one relates to that kind of exposure in terms of shame and holding on to that, can that be dispersed? Can that be healed?
Yeah, so that's a really fascinating question. I I feel like I haven't thought about it specifically in that frame, but I work a lot with mental health professionals. Like when I was in my clinical practice before I came into this role in government, we had these multidisciplinary teams, and one of the things that we um, learned is to your point, very much so. Like that being able to name it and to recognize, I think for a lot of people that um, like this isn't their fault, right? Like there's a lot that they can. I think that a lot of people who have experienced a history of adversity or significant ACEs, when they come into when they're experiencing now the symptoms of an overactive stress response, a lot of people have been told that they're the problem,
Right.
right? Or even they've told themselves that they're the problem. And so I think that to have, especially to have, a doctor or a scientist or a researcher say, no, 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 this is how the body responds to a history of adversity. This is the important piece, like, and here are some things that you can do about it, right? So here's how you recognize it. And then here is how you, here are some ways that you can support yourself or the people that you love. And I think that does go a very long way to reduce the shame and the stigma, and to help people, really direct their energy at the thing that's most important, which is healing, right? Which is like getting healthy, but I think we saw that even with HIV in the 80s, right? With like gay men who were out had a better prognosis on the same, antiretroviral drugs than gay men with HIV who were not out, because there's this level of shame and stigma and hiding that literally affects your biology, right? And it only further increases that biological stress.
That's so fascinating. It's so fascinating. And also, I think, really speaks to the power of feeling your feelings, being connected in your body, exploring them, mining them, giving yourself the space to process through things, and that ultimately can impact your longevity. It's incredible.
Yeah, and when the interesting thing about this research is that I think, and the thing that's really powerful for me is that I think that we've always known and recognized as a society that that early adversity can increase your risk for mental health and behavioral disorders, for depression or anxiety or substance dependence or suicidality, right? And that was treated in a certain way because those are all outcomes that tend to be really stigmatized societally. And then one of the things that I've observed with this research is that when you say, oh, when someone has 4 or more ACEs, their risk for heart disease and stroke and cancer is double, right? Those are no longer conditions that are conditions of bad behavior per se, right? Like when you're talking about, for folks with 2 or more ACEs, your risk for autoimmune disease, right, is double. Then people, I think, have this different response to it. And for me, I think the other thing that happens is that it really broadens the tent of the people who feel like this is something really important to address, right? So
You touched on sleep earlier, and I know, it's almost like an epidemic of sleeplessness in this country. And I think especially now with what's going on. I mean, I personally am, last night I slept horribly, but I'm sleeping much better during quarantine. I think just because the confines of life are so small and we're getting into this new interesting rhythm. But what can we do about sleeplessness? Do you have?
Yeah. So there are a couple things that we recommend. So number one, it's like the basics of, what's called sleep hygiene, right? Which is going to bed and waking up at the same time every night. Yeah. And it turns out that when you do that, your brain actually entrains, right? So your brain starts to release all those sleep-inducing neurotransmitters at the same time, and it makes them more effective, right? So I'm super religious about my sleep schedule. I am not a great sleeper. My bedtime for real is 9:00. That is no joke.
Like, is that in bed TV or that's in bed lights out?
That is in bed lights out. Like I get up at 5, but yeah. So, but my husband and I have 4 kids, so it means that a lot of when the big boys, when they're up later, he's on the night shift because he's more of a night owl, and I'm in the morning.
You have 4 kids? That's incredible.
Yeah, we have 4 boys. 4 boys. Pray for me. But it is, so going to bed and waking up at the same time is one thing that's really important. And then you talked about TV, like not having TV or devices at least 30 minutes before bedtime, things like avoiding caffeine after noon or just being aware of how your diet also affects your sleep, right? And I think that for those are some of like the mainstays of sleep hygiene. The other thing is making sure that your sleep environment is like a calm, cool, quiet environment. Those are the, whatever, that's what they say, calm, cool, and quiet environment. And then for folks who really are struggling with sleep, I really recommend it's good to like talk to your doctor, right? Because your doctor might recommend something like melatonin or another sleep aid.
Yeah. Yeah. I went the nights that I can't sleep or, I'm dealing with like perimenopausal stuff. So like there are certain nights now where I just have such a terrible time and it's torture, especially having.
So what do you do? What do you do for yourself?
So, I try never, we actually make these incredible sleep chews at Goop. I'll send you some. They're melatonin and tryptophan and B vitamins, and our in-house scientists formulated them, and they're amazing. So I'll take those if I really need to. But I have breathing exercises that I try to do, and just sort of I lie there and do a meditation, like, I'll start like at the crown of my head and sort of fill my body with like a molten sort of energy liquid thing and do sort of visualizations like that. And that tends to help me a lot too.
That's so funny that you say that, because I will say that I think that meditation for me is my most effective like sleep support. Like I do a meditation before bed, and it's like a total relaxation meditation.
What kind do you do?
I do one, so I did a neuroscience retreat at Plum Village. Are you familiar with Plum Village in France? So Thich Nhat Hanh is like he's a Vietnamese monk, and he was a kind of global, did really amazing global work around the Vietnam War and the whole thing, and then he started this monastery in France. He was exiled to France, and he started this monastery in France where they do a lot of also like very academic, like neuroscience related work with mindfulness. Wow. And so I went there. I was speaking at a neuroscience and mindfulness conference last year, and I downloaded their app. It's the Plum Village app. Wow. And so there was some a total relaxation meditation that I practiced when I was there, and then now I do it, and it's really effective for me, for my sleep.
And you do it every night?
I do it every night, because you know, like, my job is kind of stressful right now.
I know.
Yeah.
How are you going into the clinic?
So since I took on the role of Surgeon General, I had to give up my clinical practice,
Okay.
which I hope to, one day I want to get back into. That's my favorite part of being a doctor, is seeing patients. But for now, my work is around, being the Surgeon General of California.
So rad. And affecting policy, and you're helping all of those patients in a much more impactful way, I would imagine, being able to.
Well, I will say the thing that I'm most proud of is that we have, stood up this initiative called ACEs Aware in California, where we are, the first state in the nation where doctors now can get reimbursed, like they can get paid for screening for adverse childhood experiences. And then but in order to get paid for screening, they have to do training on trauma-informed care, right? And so they have to get certified. And so we're training our doctors in California about trauma-informed care. Like, can you believe that this hasn't been a part of medicine?
No, I can't.
It's just, and frankly, I want to say, like, I think that it's very easy for folks to look at it and kind of maybe, saying, oh, really, trauma-informed care? Like, that's what the California Surgeon General is focused on. But it turns out that, like, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, identified early adversity and trauma as being like a major, major, major health issue. Like, frankly, I think this is the health, like, if we can do better practice and better science, I think it has the opportunity to be one of the greatest medical advances of the 21st century, is for all, healthcare professionals to recognize and understand the role that stress and trauma plays in our health, and then what we can do to help people be healthier and live well.
Yeah. It's so important. It's amazing. And amazing that the first Surgeon General of California has this sort of consciousness going into, from such an amazing place of service and looking at a human being in that holistic way, what has happened to them and what is their emotional state. And I don't know, I think it's pretty amazing. But so for now, how much of your day is spent on coronavirus?
A lot. A lot, yeah. But in a really interesting way, right? Because everyone in health and human services, it's all hands on deck. Like, this is a once in a generation experience that we're all experiencing right now with this COVID pandemic. And one of the things that I feel really fortunate about is that I think there are some folks in health and human services where they were working on a project and they've kind of had to drop it completely and just fully focus on COVID, getting enough ventilators, getting enough testing, which we've been working so hard to do. I think I was really fortunate to be in the situation where I was able to look at a lot of the work I had been focused on in terms of the effect of stress and adversity in our health, and recognize that that work is even more important now in the era of COVID, right? Because what we're seeing now is not just that everyone's experiencing stress. So we have to understand how stress affects our health and the impact of, you know, stress-related chronic disease on, like, the impact of stress hormones on things like diabetes, right? Because we've seen in other natural disasters, right, that there's higher rates of, you know, heart attacks and strokes and diabetes and all of these things related to just the stress of the experience that we're all going through. So that was something that was really important. It's even more important right now for doctors and healthcare providers to understand that and to know what the best practices are and what the best evidence is. But the other piece is that adverse childhood experiences are going up.
Yeah.
Right. So there's more domestic violence that's happening right now.
It's so upsetting. Honestly, that idea that I can't, it's so hard to fathom. And it's of course understandable, but it's just so heartbreaking. It's really, I feel like we need, and this is what's so beautiful about your work, we need to go in and fix the systemic problems that cause, you know, this transgenerational harm from one parent to their child and on. There's like, we have to figure out a way to break that.
So yeah, I mean, that's exactly what my work is focused on, even more so right now with COVID, because what we see, for example, is if you have an adult who had ACEs in their childhood, right? So then their biology is what we call stress sensitized, which means that they're at greater risk of having a poor outcome, whether it's physical health, you know, mental health, behavioral health, with subsequent stressors, right? Because they may have an overactive stress response. So then you throw a stressor like a pandemic into the mix, and you have folks who are at greater risk of having negative health outcomes, but then also greater risk of having negative, mental and behavioral health outcomes. And so with the stress, it's literally like I'm looking. You can turn around and look at our society, and you can see that everyone's stress hormones are pumping, right? And you can see that in our reactivity. And so with that, if you think about it, right, that executive functioning, that level of some of that difficulty with impulse control, difficulty with executive functioning, for some people, like anger, frustration, all of that is just increasing. And then you throw in someone has lost their job, a job that they desperately need, and they're trying to take care of their kids and they're at home. So this is again, it's kind of taking a lot of the shame and the blame out of the equation, and just recognize that everyone's at greater risk.
Yeah.
Right. And so if we can get that word out and help people understand that, yeah, your stress hormones are really pumping right now, and here are the things that make a difference: sleep, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, mental health, healthy relationships, right? That these things are actually really healing. And that feels like it's so important and so urgent now, more so than ever.
How does one go out and forge a healthy relationship if their model for love in the home was neglectful or abusive?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to do that, but one of the most important ways is therapy, like, you know, mental health, talking to a mental health professional. And I think that there are different levels of receptiveness to therapy, but I think a lot of the stigma is less than it used to be. But that is really, I think, an important way to do that is to work with a professional, because the thing that I tell, you know, when I've been in clinic with the parents of my patients, one of the things is that I think people recognize that these things get handed down generation after generation, and it's not intentional, right? And so if you've experienced it, you're at much greater risk of handing it down to your kids.
Right.
And it's like it's like any genetic disease or any other health condition that if you get care for it, if you get treatment, then you're less likely to hand it down to your kids. Right? And I think I see a lot of parents doing things to do by their kids when they wouldn't have gotten that care for themselves.
Right.
So that feels really powerful for me, because I think the other piece of it is that for a lot of people, there's this notion that if I'm strong and I'm smart, I can just overcome, right? That I can, sure, I experienced these hard things in my childhood, but if I'm tough enough, right, I can just get over it. And I think that the part of the thing that the science is showing us, right, is that, and for many people, getting over it, what they mean is like, oh, I didn't have an addiction, or I didn't have a mental health problem, or I didn't have a whatever, when in reality, you might have none of those things and end up with, heart disease or autoimmune disease, right? So the point is that it's really important to get care, and then that dramatically reduces the risk of handing it down.
Right. I've always thought that, you know that phrase in the Bible that the sins of the child is responsible for the sins of the father. And it always was so confounding to me. Or I don't know, I'm paraphrasing. I'm not really like a Bible.
I understand. Yeah.
But you probably know it better than I do. But that general thought, and that when I became a parent, I realized, like, oh no, it's our responsibility to heal whatever the sins of our parents were. If we can heal them, then we don't carry them, and they don't become our sin. We don't pass it along.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the powerful thing is that what the science and the research shows is that the work that we do to kind of change our relationship to some of these experiences and patterns in our families, and like when we figure out how do we repair ourselves so that we can be that safe, stable, and nurturing relationship for our kids, right? It can literally change those epigenetic markers that I was talking about, literally. Like it can, so so things like that, where when we're talking about a parent who's had a history of ACEs or trauma, going to therapy, they literally, their process of doing that so that they can then deliver those daily doses of buffering care to their children literally changes their kids' like DNA, right? Like, so that is some powerful stuff, and that's something that for me, as I approach this work from this incredibly hopeful and really joyful position, because I'm like, not only do I know it can be done, I've seen it in patient after patient in my clinic, and to see a family who otherwise had really, really been struggling in these patterns that have been handed down generation after generation, and then help arm them with the information to understand, oh, this is why I'm so reactive to stuff. This is why when I get triggered, I go from 0 to 100, right? This is just my body, my biological stress response, and it's, oops, sorry about that. And it's really strong, right? It's really, and here's what I can do about it. And then that's going to change not only my experience, but my child's life, and then down the line, like for generations, right? That feels powerful.
Well, I want to be mindful of your time. I could talk to you forever, but thank you so much. This has been so incredible, really.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been so joyful. Can I just have my fan moment for just 1 second?
Of course.
Can I do a, hold on, I'm gonna see if I can do it. Do you mind if I do a screenshot?
No,
This is
no.
like my equivalent of a selfie. Hold on just 1 second. Let me see if this works. Oh, I did it. Perfect. So I'm really happy about that. And I, I wanted to just like for my own moment in advance of this interview, watch Sliding Doors because it's my all-time favorite movie.
Oh my God.
My all-time favorite, #1.
Really?
All-time. Yes.
Cool.
Because you want to know what? For me, it was very powerful and very resonant because it's very much about like what happens if we do things differently, right? Like what's the other path, you know? And so I was gonna like watch it last night, but unfortunately I didn't. It was,
You
I
have
got a lot of
to fry right now, I think.
yeah. Oh, but it's so wonderful to meet you virtually and to be able to have a conversation with you, and especially about this topic because
It's amazing.
I think
I hope I can
incredibly.
interview you again at a Goop thing or, oh, here's my daughter. Hi. Hi, sweetheart. I hope that we can further this because you just have so much to teach and your message is so critically important.
Thank you. And I really hope you enjoy the book. I know that it's like you're interviewing someone, you have to read the book, but I hope that you actually enjoy it.
No, I already am. It's amazing.
And I will tell you the opening with the story of the guy who's having a stroke. I'll just tell you, it comes back later. So I'll leave you with that.
I'm worried about the little Diego or whatever his name is. I can't remember. Is that what?
Yeah. Well, Diego comes back later as well.
Good. Oh, I can't wait. I'm gonna read it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burke.
Okay. All right. Well, take care and be well.
Too. I hope we'll meet again.
Yeah. I hope so too. Okay. Take care.